Thanks everyone for turning up. I am going to give you a little bit of a whistle-stop tour about lemur leaf frogs and all things Costa Rican. So just before I start, I want to mention very briefly, if you tuned in before, then you'll know all about this sort of stuff, but I just wanted to make a little quick shout out that it's not just me, it's a whole bunch of other people in our department, people in the whole zoo at Bristol Zoological Society, and everyone's got things going on and they've got projects and they do conservation, either in the zoo as breeding units or anything like this, or actually in field projects. So I've just put a bunch of them here. And there are some that are even kind of maybe less tangible than that, but no less important. Things like behavior change projects, which you don't necessarily associate with either necessarily being in the zoo or outside. And the palm oil project is kind of, for me, it kind of feels like one of them, but I think they even went into the field this last year. So my next sort of obligation really is to give a shout out to Daphne, who's going to give our next talk. So just bear that in mind, whether you like this one or not. I think Daph's going to say some really interesting things next time about bleeding heart doves and warty pigs and that sort of thing. So just keep that in mind. So I feel like I should introduce myself slightly. I have a bit of a history of molecular genetics, which is why I've got this big ugly picture of a chromosome at the top of the screen as a space filler. That's my ugly mug. I think that came from the Bristol Festival of Nature, where I went with the zoo. I've been to a couple of universities. I've been to a few field projects in the last 10 years or so. This first this first photo here is from South Africa. So I'm a kind of biologist at heart. I've done some projects on weird and wonderful creatures, silk moths, mole rats. Everyone thinks they're just the little naked ones, but there's loads of kinds of mole rat. I worked on the biggest one, 2 kilograms, some sort of whopping great cat-sized monster with huge teeth. And it's kind of an overlap with Ali, I feel, from last fortnight ago. I actually worked on African black oyster catchers, which cohabit a lot of the same areas of coastline as the African penguins. So when Ali was talking about things like Dyer and all these locations, Robben Island, actually a lot of these places were where we were sampling for African black oyster catchers. It's really cool. And actually, so it's nice to see that some of the measures that have been brought in to combat problems caused by humans on wildlife have really affected other species and been kind of mitigated. So, for example, the African black oyster catchers really benefited from the ban in South Africa of driving on the beach. And their numbers are on the increase now. They're least concerned. They're not even a problem anymore. So that's really cool, a really good story. I also spent other time in other weird and wonderful places. I went to Saudi Arabia, of all places, and worked on a bunch of different creatures. A lot of them rodents, things like jerds, jerboas. Jerboas aren't rodents, actually. Yeah, I guess they are. They're just not your sort of typical small mammal. And that's where I also found some amazing taxidermy, which is why I did work on hedgehogs, but this hedgehog at the bottom here there was some incredible taxidermy in the university there, and I thought I'd include a bit of that. So I've got quite a history of working in different places. So I was actually really stoked to come to Bristol Zoo, where everyone has their own little projects. They all have the opportunities to go and do field projects and actually work in sort of conservation proper. So my background is more of a research scientist, using a bit of DNA. But as Ali said last time, we've actually doing a bit of DNA stuff in the zoo as well now. So that's actually really nice. But the reason we're here is to talk about lemur leaf frogs. And lemur leaf frogs have a really great history at Bristol Zoo. And I hope Tim isn't watching to see that I've put a big picture of him up. But one of the real sort of main players of this was our reptile curator at Bristol Zoological Society, Tim Skelton. And he really was fundamental in working with other groups like Manchester Museum, sort of a few different places. At the bottom here, there's an example of the Costa Rican Amphibian Research Center project. So these are different players, the first players in the breeding game, and actually the first UK zoo to really start to understand how to keep lemur leaf frogs in captivity. So my internet's not good. But this really led on to much later, after I guess we've done a little bit of breeding, to the establishment of a stud book for the species, which is really great. So it means we can collaborate with a load of different organizations and actually get sort of a formalized breeding program to keep the species safe in captivity. So this is kind of the background for why we have moved on to using the lemur leaf frog as a way to start looking into conservation in the field in Costa Rica, which is part of the leaf frogs range. I'll talk about it in a second. But here's a bit of a timeline to show that actually over the kind of last couple of years, we've started to gain a bit of momentum, and we've actually started to move some of our, while the ex situ, the breeding program is still ongoing, starting to actually do a bit of work in the field to try and work out how we can find conservation solutions for a declining, critically endangered species in its native habitat. And as you can see, there are some really great things. We've bred over 200 lemur frogs for the captive population. Historically, we've sponsored places like the Costa Rican Amphibian Research Center, and we're really starting to get involved with the species. So that brings us to the strategy. So I don't expect you to read our strategy. I just want you to see the take-home main points. And what I really want to kind of talk about today is the field project and actually what we end up getting done in the field. So let's hit straight to the main points of our strategy. What we want to do is a conservation project for a species in the wild. We want to make sure that it's, you know, it's reversing its decline. As I said, it's a critically endangered species, so they suffered massive range decreases and population size decreases. So what we want to do is try and find out what's happening and how we can help. So these are basically sort of the 3 points that I want to look at today. So the idea of the in the actual native range project would be to survey, to actually see if we can find, you know, relic populations or populations that are not known about, have a look at them in their native range, see if we can find out what's actually threatening them now. It might be the same as it used to be. It might be something completely new. We don't know until we have a look. And then to try and work with local organizations and local communities to actually try and mitigate some of those problems. So this is sort of the overarching theme that is going to run through what I'm talking about today, and you know, it's essential and part of the project. So now into lemur leaf frogs. So I know I am very biased, but lemur leaf frogs are obviously really beautiful, and that means we should all love them, but they're tiny. They have decreased from their range. If you see this diagram I've got of their sort of native range, this is Central America. I've kind of cut it off a little bit for this diagram, but Central America is a really interesting place because it's kind of this melting pot where you get two continents kind of touching, and that's why it's so hyperdiverse here. actually near the tropics. It's got over 200 species of amphibians alone. I've got this book that I got, a great big tome, and it's just a description of trying to get hold of some of the species and, you know, describe them and tell you where to find them in case you're going to try. And it's crazy. It's this, you know, really beautiful diverse location, and it's got some really great things going on. It's got some problems, and this is where we find lemur leaf frogs. We also find some of the sister species. So in Costa Rica, which is going to be the focus because it's got such a population decline in Costa Rica, then we're going to focus really on Costa Rica. There's real uncertainty as to how many populations of lemur leaf frog are actually in the west of Panama, and even into Colombia. There are supposed to be some. It's not really sure how they're doing, but we're going to focus on Costa Rica because it seems like there are big declines in Costa Rica. But in Costa Rica, there's another 4 sister species, and they're all kind of similar because they're sister species, so they share sort of some sort of ancestry, but they're all kind of crazy different. I mean, you've seen this really popular, the red-eyed tree frog, this bottom right, is a very iconic organism, really colorful, you know, bright. The next one along, huge golden eyes. I've got some terrible pictures of Sporellia and Saltata, but they're sort of similar. They're getting towards a kind of more greeny, and the lemur frogs are the smallest of all of them. The lemur frogs are tiny. They're between sort of 2 and 5 grams. So you can imagine how big that is. That's, you know, kind of, we're talking sort of 5 centimeters here, not massive creatures. So you can understand if, you know, potentially they've been overlooked, and maybe they're, you know, having a bit of a survey, we'll actually find more of them. But this is the species we're looking at. So the lemur leaf frog lives in, if you look at the range, it's basically pre-montane wet forest. So if you look at Costa Rica, it's largely drier on the Pacific side and sort of wetter on the Atlantic side. So the Atlantic side is this eastern side, sort of going towards Panama, and that's actually the sort of more moist forest. And as you go up into the mountains, there's kind of a central ridge of a mountain and a lot of volcanic activity, actually. It's really cool. And then you find the lemur leaf frog's range should be in these wetter, sort of pre-montane to montane mountain areas. So where the temperatures are a bit lower, because that's actually kind of what they want. So a little bit about Costa Rica. Costa Rica is an amazing country, and it's a really popular country. So you may have heard things about it. In fact, you may have visited, because something like 90,000 UK nationals visit Costa Rica each year. It's quite famous for its environmental policy. They've got some really historic systems about dealing with protected areas. I mean, they've got the coverage of protected areas is something like 28% of the land. I've put in a bit of a map just to show you an example of kind of what that looks like. It's also got great policies for sort of things like renewable energy. So I tried to do a little diagram there which shows proportionally with diagrams how much of each of the renewable energy sources are employed for the national grid. So it's mostly hydroelectric, but there's some geothermal and some wind. So that's amazing, but it's just the grid. Obviously there's lots of vehicles, so they still drink a lot of fuel, but the grid is actually entirely renewably sourced. So this is a country that at one point was losing something like 5% of forest cover a year. Okay, so they've really pulled it back. They supply something, at one point they were supplying something like 13% of the world's bananas. So you can imagine it's quite an interesting sort of juxtaposition between being this tourist destination now and kind of having a huge productivity, especially considering how we're going to move into habitat loss, because this is kind of relevant to this, how actually the population size has grown. The population size. Since 1955, when it was about 1 million, the population size of Costa Rica is now over 5 million. So this has huge sort of ramifications on resource consumption, space for development, all that sort of stuff. So here, I found a few figures and I sort of fudged them into a story about forest cover. And if you look, in 1940, you know, sort of after humans have been active for a bit, but there's still a lot of forest cover. Down to 1987, there's only 21% of forest cover, and now it's way back up by 2010. And I think the trajectory for at least a few years was increasing, but there is still some loss of forest now. I mean, when you talk about forest, you obviously have to talk about different types of forest. So if you're talking about mature stands, they're still losing some mature stands, but that's being replaced by forest planting and that sort of stuff. If you imagine, there aren't the pressures that there used to be for massive forest clearing. There was a lot of forest logging in the kind of up until the 80s. And also that's a lot of ranching for cattle consumed some of that land. And of course, the crops, pineapple, banana, and I actually saw a fair amount of oil palm when I was there last year. So I don't know if it's starting or if it's always going to be a small thing, but I know it's a problem elsewhere. So there are, you know, potential threats and also associated threats. So there's problems that you get with crops such as banana, you get crop spraying and that sort of stuff. So when you're talking about the threat of habitat loss to organisms like the lemur leaf frog, you've got to think about the big picture and you've got to think about what else is happening. So I certainly saw crop spraying from aeroplanes, and that's not exactly a targeted method of pest control. That is going to be kind of broad and crazy. So there are some problems with habitat loss, and that's a consideration. But when you think of amphibians, you probably don't think of habitat loss necessarily directly. You probably think of something like chytrid fungus. Now, if you don't know about chytrid fungus is one of these things that affects a huge number of species globally. And a lot of amphibians, even in Europe, there's a similar pathogen, Patacochitrium salamandrus, and that's also affecting species in Europe really badly. But in Costa Rica, actually, they've documented the passage of this chytrid pathogen, which started to go through Central America in sort of the 80s. So this is kind of a combination of threats coming together to actually impact on populations such as amphibians, and really kind of double whammy them. So you've got this pathogen which causes high levels of mortality, stays in the environment quite a lot, combined with habitat loss. So we've got kind of a bit of a nasty story, particularly possibly for species like the lemur leaf frog, because the fungus likes slightly cooler conditions, and so does the lemur leaf frog actually. So the higher elevation you get up to, the sort of better it is potentially for the fungus. And so you might expect that this place up in the mountains where you're a bit safer from banana plantations, you might actually be more at risk from a fungus. So they are, potentially in a slightly bad position, which is why I guess we've seen quite hefty declines in the population sizes, and why we need to find out what's going on and actually start to see how this is going to progress, because obviously then we've got other issues. We've got potentially climate change effects. There have been lots of conversations about what happens with climate change in the tropics, and one of the suggestions is it homogenizes day-night temperatures by increasing cloud cover, which blocks out the sun during the day. And lemur leaf frogs are one of these species that's been known to bask in the sun, and that's could be for a number of reasons, but one of the benefits of such behavior is that it can get rid of things like a fungal pathogen, which is amazing actually. So there's lots of kind of little subtle behavioral things that lemur leaf frogs are just great for. So I'm going to talk about what we did in 2018. So because one of the things we need to know is where to find the lemur leaf frogs. We had some idea about the range, the previous range, but if you imagine, when the previous range was described, these were probably brand new roads cut through the rainforest. So if the lemur leaf frogs are particularly forest central species, you know, loves being in closed canopy, loves being away from disturbance, you might not expect to find it next to a highway now, but you might have done back when the roads were first made. So we already knew we were potentially at a bit of a disadvantage. So we went around the range, and it was quite an interesting experience to travel around and to try and work out if we can visit these old spots where lemur frogs have been described before as occurring, and see if we can find suitable habitat, whilst at the same time not being 100% sure what suitable habitat might be. So I also included this nice graphic that one of my students made at the bottom here, which is a elevational, it gives you an idea of elevation. So the dark coloration is the sort of mountains, because this map doesn't really show you, it shows there's a bit of a spine of forest, which is actually map is following the forest, is following the mountains, but this bottom one shows you a bit better. And I actually put the sampling locations we went to actually look for leaf frogs, and they're obviously related. We're going to slightly higher elevations because a lot of Costa Rica is very lowland, and it's sort of really hot forest and sort of swampy bits, and that's not really the leaf frog's habitat. So we went around we had a guide, this incredible guy who could see a sloth whilst driving at about a kilometre away, which is just incredible. And we tried to find, go into the forest and try to find these frogs, trying to find appropriate habitat, trying to find breeding pools, and trying to work out where these creatures are. So here we have my beautiful assistant, Adam. And I've got this slightly in dark because I want to start to tell you about the story of the leaf frog's habits, because they're not convenient and around during the day like you'd want them to be, so you could find them easily. They're always active during the night. So we have to go out at night. And that means you have to use a variety of different methods. So you can use, potentially, you can use torchlight searches, but if you imagine these creatures are quite small, and also, I'll show you the pictures in a minute, but they're also different colors. They're quite cryptically colored at night as well. Another option is to use an acoustic recorder, and that's a really good option because you can leave it set up overnight, and you can come and get it later, and then you download the information onto your computer and you can listen to see if you got the calls, and then you can automate it, because actually the forest at night is like a motorway. It's just absolutely crazy. It's so noisy, it's so full of insects, it's so full of rustling, it's just incredible. And so many frog calls. We saw so many frogs everywhere we went, and I mean that was reassuring because we're looking for frogs. And occasionally we found snakes. I was basically spending my time in the forest with a guy who was desperate to find a bushmaster, which is one of the more venomous of the species you find in the forest, which was great. I suspect his first reaction would be to move towards it rather than away from it. But we did find, I have found a fer-de-lance, which are one of the more aggressive ones, snakes, venomous snakes, on each of our field trips so far, which is it's great. This picture of Adam, who's part of our reptile team, was after he unfortunately fell up to his waist in a pool of water and was muttering to himself while emptying his Wellingtons. He was not best happy, but that reminds me that bringing someone along who's an expert and has been involved in the breeding of this species in captivity is really, really useful, because he knows what the tadpoles look like. He knows what the spawn look like. I've got this really dry guide by this the author Savage, who's described the tadpole morphology, and it's incredible. It is the most unintelligible. It's completely, I have nothing. I'm going down this dichotomous key, and I'm trying to count the number of mouth ridges on a tadpole that's squirming around in a bag in front of me. It's crazy. So yeah, Adam proved himself invaluable in that respect. And actually, when we did the acoustic recording, one of the things we did was we actually formally described this call, because it's really difficult without this reference material. So I got a couple of the students to push that one through, and we've got this really nice little publication on how you analyze for lemur frog calls. So you can just program in this code, which is really nice, and I think a really great thing to come out of it. We found a lot of creatures when we went around the forest. I just want to point out that everywhere you look, you find, I think we found something like 35 species that we could identify. And I'm guessing that half of those were cryptic morphs of one another. So it absolutely crazy. We also found a bunch of other things, like some really great stuff. The amount of times I saw a snail-eating snake and thought it was like a coral snake or something, super venomous. I can't even count. We found some great things like whip scorpions, and huge, you should see the size of some of these cockroaches. This top corner picture of the cockroach, and it was the size of my hand. And there are some rulers being pressed against insects in various different places. You'd be surprised how much noise a tiny little mammal makes when it's rustling in the trees above you, sort of pretending to be something savage and venomous. But in all this time, we went to something like 27 locations all over central Costa Rica. And actually, we only found lemur frogs in 2 locations, both of which were I think almost certainly translocation. So if you see these 2 stars I put on the map, certainly humans knew they were there, and they have been moving lemur frogs around. So it's a really tough one, huh? If you think about species conservation, and you also think about disease involved, and people are moving around populations potentially to save them from negative situations, potentially to have them on their property. I mean, it's one of these sort of conundrums. But we found 2 healthy populations, and information about the wild population that we know about. So this is really good fuel for the next field trip, which was last year. And what we want to do, like I mentioned in the strategy, we want to try and analyze the current threats to the populations. And it's really difficult to do that if we can't find the species, we can't find the beast. So translocated populations are all great, but if you don't know the history of the population, you don't really know details about whether it's increasing, decreasing, is it being propped up by people moving the frogs around? That's really hard to know. So we want to see a wild natural population and see what's going on. So I've done a really crude map here with the Lammerstad National Park included on it. And just talking about this, just to show these different populations. So this red one is a place we visited in 2018, quite low, but suspiciously low. And I think it's almost certainly a translocation, but it could also be dispersed individuals as well. The original population that another translocation event came from, which was this yellow star, this Fila Asuncion, which we're going to go to this year, although I won't be involved, sadly. We've got our lockdown stand-in who's chomping at the bit right now to go. And then what's really interesting is this blue mountain population, which we went to, and that's a natural population. It's a natural pool of lemur frogs. We wanted to see actually what the population looks like, because once we can see what they're supposed to, how they're supposed to live, what they're doing, we can start to think about the threats seriously. So there's lots of things going on. And you can even see how, like, we heard stories about logging area, secondary regrowth. And when we went to these places, incredible, even down low where we know there's been translocation, but we're finding lemur frogs in great big pools. So this pool at the bottom here is, there were kingfishers flying past, there were snapping turtles in it. It was an absolute jungle. The sound of this place at night was impossible to hear a lemur frog. We saw one, but just one. And, you know, at a distance, and just crazy. But this is secondary regrowth. So this is really nice. So this is from this great big logging effort sort of previously. And what's nice is that it shows that they're around, whether it's because they're moving from translocated areas or not, they are moving through and they're able to sort of survive in these areas. So we wanted to go up to this mountain and we wanted to sort of answer some of our questions. So we do know a few things. We know that the populations are vulnerable to land use change. One of the translocated populations was because it was a change in ownership of an abandoned farm had been taken over by some, they call them squatters. I have no idea what that means. But these people were changing the land use and potentially the population was going to be extirpated. So some of them were moved. And no one's been back since. This is 15 years ago. So we know they're potentially vulnerable to land use change. There is also an example of a digger, I think it was, drove into a pond. And since then, a pond that was known to have lemur frogs in never had lemur frogs in after that. So we know pollution is potentially important as well. We know they're easy to find when they're around breeding sites, and we know they breed in artificial containers, which is amazing. There are 2 places where people have put up, you know, plastic buckets, and these frogs are breeding in them. It's absolutely crazy and amazing. So we have loads more questions because we want to know how we can address threats. How, you know, what do natural pools look like? Can we, if we're going to make artificial pools, and it seems to be successful, like how can we make them emulate the natural ones? How do they use the habitat? If it was next to a road, would they all get run over or would they be fine? You know, would they suffer from chytrid fungus because they're close to potentially lots of foot traffic or other species at lower elevations or higher elevations? You know, how many frogs do we expect? What's a healthy population? And then we can start thinking about more complicated things like mortality. I mean, just because you see some frogs breeding doesn't mean you're seeing a healthy population. All the tadpoles may die, or the juveniles may die. You just don't know. So you need to have more information. So it turned into a bit of a research expedition. And I took some students with me. Here's some fresh-faced master students. And they were great. The one took about 3 kilograms of protein bars with him on a 18-kilometer uphill hike into the forest and about 1 liter of water. So you can imagine how this turned out. He was foisting protein bars on us at every turn for the next 4 days to try and lighten his load, which was amazing. The trip up to the forest was also made a little bit more entertaining by the fact that our trip lead got stung by bees and had an allergic reaction. So while he's saying, I'm fine, his eyes are being covered over by his swelling face. And only then do we realize that one of the indigenous guys who was calling himself doctor was doing that because he actually had a medical case and it had like a adrenaline pen or an EpiPen or whatever you need for to stop them going to anaphylactic shock, which was great. So it was good to know. The other interesting thing that happened on the way up was we were with a bat expert who found a colony of tented bats. Actually, I have a little picture at the very top of this slide of me trying to get a photo up into this colony of tented bats. And they're very, very cute, little stripy faced critters. And this one guy, Diego, he got my student to hold a net up on one side of this tent. It was just like basically an umbrella that's not been sort of put up properly with bats in it, quite high up. And he put a net on one side only, and then he shook the umbrella of the plant. And the bats obviously just flew off in the other direction. And I must admit, I had to, for political reasons, I had to turn away at that moment and pretend to be doing something else. But it was it was quite a walk, and we got up to this incredible pond. My pictures don't do it justice. It's really hard to take pictures when it's just trees everywhere. But I've got a picture here of going sort of down into the water, because it was steep-sided. It's really a really interesting, and it seems like a pretty unique situation, a sort of top of a hill with a really deep pond sort of almost dug into it. So wanted to see what these populations are like. And this is really close to this original population that was translocated before. So it's really nice to see how they look and get a bit more information about what's going on with the species. So if you can see, I drew a graph here of just how they use the habitat. Like, do they always sit at a certain height in the trees, or do they use what's available? And it seems like a really stupid point to make, but they just sit on what's available. And we're finding frogs all around the pools. So these are all males. So obviously begs the question, are they the same males? But what was also really amazing about this is that you can find them as they go to bed. So if you get up, if you're there early in the morning, before it gets light, you can follow frogs and you can watch them go to bed, which seems a bit creepy, but actually it's the only way to know where they're going to come from the next day. Because if you look at this picture at the bottom, you see that the frogs have a daytime and a nighttime coloration. I've lost myself. So at the bottom here, it shows that the light coloration is what they look like during the day, and the dark coloration is what they look like at night. So during the day, they're bright colors because they're camouflaged against bright leaves. And at night, they're sort of hopping around and doing things, and they're kind of dark, be a bit more camouflaged. So if you see this picture on the left, there's actually a lemur frog who's, I've highlighted him now, who's just kind of chilling out in his daytime coloration on one of these leaves. And this is what we were trying to do, is trying to find these guys and work out, what parts of the habitat are using, and if we can get a photo of them to identify them when they're in their daytime coloration. Because what's amazing is they've got individual spots, just like the penguins again. You can actually see. And what I did is I made a little local map of one of the pond systems, and I tried to work out if they always stay in the same place, like a little territorial beast, or whether they move around, or whether they're completely different frogs every night. Imagine that. There's actually 400 frogs around the pond. It's just that they take it in turns, and like 10 of them come out every night. Because that's entirely possible, right? The forest is huge and they're tiny. So we start to take individual shots. And what was really great is we actually saw that frogs were moving around. So over something like 9 nights, this example of this individual could be seen in 3 different places, which were like 20 meters apart. I'm going to make a big picture of so these are the identification bit. I was just doing it by eye initially, but I'm sure you can get computer algorithms to identify them. But these I consider all to be the same individual. So I don't know how you feel about that, but I'm fairly happy that they are. And I think this suggests that, the frogs stay around. And these are all males. So we only saw 1 female in the last field trip we went, and we only saw 1 on the previous field trip as well. So you don't see many females. So where are the females? I'm just going to back up really slightly and just say, we did look for chytrid fungus, but it's a really complicated story. We were using some interesting test kits. I think it's there, and these guys are probably to some degree resistant. But I think it's more of a complicated story that we have to look into a bit more than I thought was just going to be this amazing, oh, it's there, or it's in this bit and not in this bit. I think now there's also information to suggest there's different types of chytrid, and you have to be a bit more canny about what you look for as well. So one of the last things I want to say about these guys is how amazing they are when it gets to the full moon. So they honestly, they start to get super crazy. They start fighting, they start mating. This is, I saw on the same night, I saw 2 fights between males where they kind of grab each other and try and wrestle each other off the branch onto the floor. And then I also watched the very tedious courtship behavior where a female jumped in front of a male several times until he actually noticed, and then he jumped on her back, and then something like 6 hours later, they laid some eggs under a leaf. And I must admit, I do not think it's true. When you look at the literature and it says that the females can lay 2 lots of eggs in one night. How do they have time for that? I don't believe it. If it takes that long to lay 1 set of eggs. But that was very interesting. And I've got a student who's looking into the effects of potentially phases of the moon on activity cycles like this, because that could be really interesting as well. That might be, you just go and look for them when it's full moon, because they're super active and there's all of them out. So the last thing I really want to say is that the last point we were trying to get to after the threat analysis was to look at conservation actions in conjunction with stakeholders. And what we've done is we've talked to loads of guys. We've talked to Indigenous people. We've got Indigenous people helping us go up to the mountain. We've been collaborating with researchers there. That Jeep picture I showed you earlier, that was a researcher with a master's student who came down and drove us around in his little Jeep, sometimes with the handbrake on, to hilarious effect. And it was really great to actually start to get involved and start to see who's doing what. How can you get contact with people? How can you get to new areas? Because that's what we need to do. We need to think about habitat creation, breeding habitat. We need to think about how to assess how populations are doing once we found them. And we need to go and find new habitats that potentially have lemur frogs, because they might be more common than we think. And if that's the case, then that's absolutely fantastic. There's some great areas that we can look at. There's an entire national park between us in this last place and Panama that hasn't been looked at. And we've actually got a guy on the ground, our sloth eyes guy. He is going to go and do that for us, because we unfortunately can't go this year, which is very annoying. But yeah, I have to add, I took some camera trap pictures. That's why the pictures at the bottom of this slide are so awful, but they're all camera traps. And we saw so many. I mean, if you're more interested in mammals, we saw loads of amazing things, including potentially an ocelot, which is really cool. I don't think they'd seen one there before. So that leaves me, I realized I'd completely slaughtered my idea of only speaking for half an hour. And I just want to say, thank you very much for sort of coming along with me on this ride. And I just want to mention again that actually we can't do it without support of you guys, without support of our funders. We've been funded on this project, in the field project only. So far, we've been funded by Mohammed bin Zayed. We've got current funding from the Sheldon Wildlife Trust and the Amphibian Survival Alliance. And that really is pushing the project forward. So I think if you feel like you also want to support any of the zoo's good work, then that's an option. And I just need to mention that you should tune in for DAF next time. Before I say, has anyone got any questions?
Tim, thanks for a fantastic talk. So feel free, anybody, to type up your questions and ask them in the group chat. Tim, can you see the chat questions?
I am going to go onto the right page. So I will have to go onto Zoom. Ah, where am I? One second. I don't know if I have to just stop sharing if I stop sharing that, then can I see questions?
If you take a look at the chat file, you should be able to see them.
Okay, it's coming up.
If not, then I can pass them on to you.
Yes. Is there any treatment for chytrid fungus? Is that the first one?
No, there were a couple beforehand. Do you want me to just tell you the two beforehand? So Grace asks how the frogs change their color. Is it dependent on light levels or on circadian rhythms?
Interesting question. I don't know the answer to. Yeah, that's really interesting. I think, although I never verified it, I think it's to do with metabolic rates, because they go to sleep sometimes when it's light, sometimes when it's dark, and you can see sometimes they're going to go to find a refuge under a leaf or go to bed, like we call it. You can see they're going to sometimes like 15 minutes before they go. They'll suddenly adopt the diurnal coloration and they'll still be walking around. So potentially, I think it's when they suddenly realize, oh, I'm a bit tired, they'd start to slow down, and yeah, that happens. I'm not sure. I suspect it's just quite a few of these creatures have pigments in their skin that they can just move around in the cells. So I would assume it's something like that.
Okay. And then another question from Paul, which is about our care at the zoo, asking, do we mimic the same day and night behavior cycle that you see in the field?
Oh, that's interesting. So no, I mean, they have a cycle. Yeah, so they don't change the cycle, to my knowledge, between seasons or anything, but they do change misting and sort of hydrodynamics, like water availability and things like that. And I think that's how they trigger breeding, but I don't think they give them the same day-night cycle. I think they just have like a half and half. But I'm not 100% sure, so I might be talking rubbish.
Okay, so those are the only two questions that were before the ones that you can see, so feel free
okay, brilliant.
through them.
Is there any treatment for chytrid fungus? Yeah, really, really interesting, actually. There's a few different things they do. So what I meant to say at the end was, I wanted to do what Ali's did and have a really optimistic end. I think it's all pretty optimistic anyway, but actually there's some great examples of populations that have had huge declines from chytrid that have bounced back or are in the process of bouncing back. So one treatment is to you can get a special disinfectant. It's basically just like a hand soap thing, and actually you can clear it that way. And they've actually applied this to a habitat, controversially I might add, in Mallorca with the Mallorcan midwife toads. They actually completely sort of bleached the habitat and then put the toads back, and that did get rid of the chytrid. I wouldn't say that that's the best way of doing it, but chytrid has been purged from populations in different ways. So in Panama, they've seen Atelopus toads have naturally bounced back on a 10-year cycle. So they're actually starting to see species they thought were extinct in the forest there that are coming back. So it's possible it's just a time thing. And they've also seen, they've been doing some work with yellow-legged frogs in California, and they've seen that actually if they go through this process of recolonizing, they take ponds which had populations but got chytrid, and what they do is they get these ponds that survived, they take the eggs that were laid in the wild, they dose them with chytrid, they clear them from chytrid, and then they put them out as young animals in these new locations, and they find that is a relatively successful way. So there's loads of different things to do, obviously some of them more or less intense, but yeah. Do you have any plans to use the zoo hosted population to answer behavioral ecology questions that might be difficult to answer in the wild? Yeah, I've got some questions. I'm really curious about how things like temperature and humidity affect lemur frog behavior, because they have to, they're really actually quite sensitive to temperature. So in the summer, they need to be cooled down in the UK. Otherwise they get too hot. Because obviously in the wild, they've got all these mechanisms to regulate their own temperature. They can move up and down in the canopy. They can move into wind, breezes, which sounds ridiculous, but frogs can change their temperature by like 4 or 5 degrees just by changing the angle of their body, their wet body in a breeze. So I would really, I've got a couple of things I'm really interested in, like types of call, how they respond to different environmental gradients. Yeah, phases of the moon, like lighting regimes. Yeah, I've only just sort of started to think of them, and these are things we have to start to do. Yeah. There's information sharing with all your images. No, so I haven't actually. I've been sharing my images with a local conservation charity, and some of those images I know, particularly things like the camera trap images, have been taken into a local research project, but I haven't uploaded anything to like a local authority or a record page, and that's a really good idea actually. One of my hesitations is my ID skills with a lot of these cryptic amphibian species, but actually, potentially, if you've got a location and you've got a photo, you don't need to ID yourself. So maybe that is a way around that, and you can just put like a non-definite on your species ID. Yeah, that's a really good idea, and that's something I've not actually done yet. Chris, do you breed and release back into the wild? So currently, we breed, but we don't release them into the wild because the authorities in Costa Rica don't allow that at present. So the idea is the breeding population in the UK and Europe is one that is an insurance population. But yeah, it is Europe because there's a population in Sweden as well. Well, part of the breeding population. But actually, at the moment, we have no definite plans to release back into the wild until Costa Rica reconsiders, and I don't know what that depends on. So yeah, that's the situation with that. Oh, from Tim. Yeah, great. Thank you, Tim. He said that we changed the humidity and temperatures, but the day-night cycle is actually kind of Bristol based. Yeah, that's really interesting. Thanks, Tim. Sorry if I'm giving false information. I hope I'm not. Yeah, so that's all the kind of direct questions. I don't know if that's us.
So in that case,
Tim's also interested if the moon is playing a part. Yeah, I think that would be really interesting.
So we have time for perhaps one more question if anyone has one. If you do have any further questions, then please feel free to email us. You can send an email directly to Tim, or you can send an email to me. My email address is mabrahams@bristolzoo.org.uk. Tim, thank you very much again for a fantastic talk. That's wonderful. Everybody that joined us today, thank you very much for joining us in our conservation lecture when it's such blazingly glorious weather outside. So we feel very privileged to have you here. And up on the screen, you see the holding slide for the lecture, which will be happening in a fortnight's time, and that's going to be Caring for a Bleeding Heart, the conservation of bleeding heart doves in the Philippines by Dr. Daphne Karawas. So thank you all for joining us, and have a lovely fortnight.